Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Laidlaw, and on behalf of our team, I want to welcome you to Open Circle this morning. Open Circle is an inclusively Christian spiritual community that meets in West Michigan or wherever you are right now. So, whether you have joined us in the past at one of our in person gatherings or just more recently you've been catching up with us online, we are really glad that you are joining us this morning. A couple of items to note as we get started. First, I want to wish everybody a happy Father's Day, regardless of what this day may mean for you or symbolize for you. We hope that you are able to make the most of this day. Second, this week we posted a position to join our staff team at Open Circle. We are looking for a part-time program coordinator, somebody who can help solidify our Sunday morning experiences and can help support the expansion of our programming beyond Sunday morning. This is going to be a really vital role for the future of our community, and it's important that we find some great candidates for this position. You can find out more about this role at opencirclecommunity.org. We would be so grateful if you helped us spread the word about this opportunity. And last, this morning we had the opportunity to hear from a friend of ours, Naomi Boase. She is somebody who actually helped shape sort of the origins of our story together as a community just around 2 years ago. She has extensive experience in education around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is doing some great work in Boston. You can find out more about her bio online, but I'll say this about Naomi. She is somebody whose courage and vulnerability and presence has dramatically shifted my thinking and how I approach not just thinking about community, but life and spirituality in general. She's shifted my thinking on those things in so many ways. And I'm so grateful she was willing to so vulnerably share with us this morning. So this is our conversation with Naomi Boase. Hello, Naomi Boase.
I'm Matt Laidlaw.
Welcome to Open Circle.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, good. Well, speaking of here, you are in Boston and I am in West Michigan. I'm also in very close proximity to my children, which means it's really possible we're going to have some interruptions this morning. And you may have some interruptions as well. So we're just going to roll with it no matter what happens.
Yes, my dog is right here. So barking like her.
Okay, awesome. So I'm really, really grateful for your willingness to join us this morning. I don't think there's too many people in Open Circle who know this, but there was a brief window in time when you were living back in West Michigan, and it was right when Open Circle was sort of beginning. So this is just under 2 years ago. And you were very generous and gracious in offering your story, time, energy, expertise, and helping to shape the imagination for our community. And just when we were sort of like beginning to meet is when life took you somewhere else. But I'm really, really grateful that you're willing to join us this morning.
Absolutely.
Okay. You seem just about as excited as I am. So
we've had disclaimer, we've had quite a time trying to make this happen. So
yes, we have.
You're joining all
yes.
on Friday, but really a Monday.
So. Yes. So family interruptions, power outages, loss of internet, and here we are. So before we get started with a handful of questions that I have for you, beyond the disclaimers of whatever interruptions that might happen, I want to remind or offer to anybody who is watching or listening right now, we're going to have a brief time at the end of this conversation for an activity. So if you want to grab a piece of paper, pen or pencil, at some point during this conversation, you'll find that helpful when we get closer to the end. So was there anything else that we needed to remind people of, Naomi?
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, for sure. So, Naomi, you grew up in West Michigan and you graduated from high school in 2007. And you have been on quite a journey since then. So, I'm wondering if you can give us just the fast forward overview of what you've been involved in regarding education, training, work, and some of the adventures that you've had.
Yeah, the short version. I've moved a lot. I actually, so I completed my undergrad at Taylor University, studying international studies. And really the majority of the last 13 years, which I just did the math on that, and that's surreal. Yeah, has been spent studying the Middle East or living in the Middle East, primarily Jordan and Palestine, with a short stint in there to do my master's in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And it's worth mentioning that those two institutions are literally on other opposite ends of the spectrum. One being the most liberal institution in the world, and one being probably, one of the most conservative. And I'm really thankful for those opportunities to see both ends of those spectrums. But yeah, since coming back from the Middle East, that's when I was in West Michigan briefly again and sort of participated in the beginnings of Open Circle, which I was extremely thankful for. The way of the circle, that practice is something that I've actually carried through to my work now. Matt was emotional. I literally went home and wept. So yeah, I'm really thankful for this community, and I'm glad that it's continuing and that I get to join you again today.
Awesome. So I know that alongside of your own evolving spirituality and faith, as you have traveled and studied, your understanding of your own identity has been something that that you've been experiencing alongside of the evolution of your own spirituality and learning and growth. So I'm wondering if you'd be able to talk a little bit about how you experienced your identity in West Michigan, and how you have your identities in West Michigan, and how you've experienced your identities outside of West Michigan.
Yeah, I mean, where to start? I think I want to lead with some vulnerability in this question. I think that's really important. I mean, being gay in West Michigan was debilitating, and it still is when I go home. And I also want to start with making something really clear, which is the pain of that, and that is still very real. I think that some people believe that because I've landed finally, by the way, I can hear like the applause in the background with my friends, that I've landed on the issue of faith and sexuality, that I'm 100% affirming. People think that because I've landed there, and that's what I believe, that I'm miraculously healed from the homophobia and the ways in which Christianity in West Michigan was and still is weaponized against me. So some people somehow equate my affirmation and realization and revelation of being affirming with this idea that there's no more pain attached to my queerness. And I have arrived at that affirmation, but I have not arrived at being healed from what happened to me in West Michigan or in the Midwest, because Taylor University. So it's very emotional to be here today and offer myself to a West Michigan community. And I want to make that anxiety and heartache and fear and pain real from the start of our conversation. Because what happens is often when people on the margins offer themselves to the majority, which my understanding, the demographic of Open Circle West Michigan is a majority community. When people like myself on the margins offer themselves to the majority, there's an assumption that we're whole persons. I'm able to sit here in front of you and offer myself, and that means like I'm okay and I'm healed. But the reality is I'm still ripped apart by homophobia that runs rampant in West Michigan and in Christian communities. And I have to fight for my wholeness. And if you don't recognize that feeling, if you don't resonate with that, that's privilege. And that means it's actually your responsibility to help me fight for my wholeness. And Matt, you and I have had an amazing journey, and your affirmation of me has been a huge part of my healing. But this is kind of like a side beginning tangent to what I want to say about West Michigan, which is kind of like a calling into your community of not thinking that because I'm sitting here in front of you that I'm whole.
Yeah.
And to get into what it was, a little bit more of what it was like to be in West Michigan. When I think about this question, I want to start with saying, I'm like compelled to say, being gay stripped me of so much love and so many opportunities. I actually remember writing in one of my journal entries in high school that being gay is like a cancer. Like it has the potential to ruin all of my relationships. But that is the internalized homophobia that like sits deeply in my body and may always sit in my body. But I want you in Open Circle to hear this loud and clear that it isn't being gay that took so much away from me. It's the homophobia that is alive and well in West Michigan that took so much away from me. And just recognizing that if you're a believer in Jesus, like it is literally the antithesis of Jesus, to practice that and think that because, precisely because it tears queer people apart and prevents wholeness. So I know this is a long answer to your question, but in short, I was terrified of my sexual identity in West Michigan. I knew when I was probably 7 or 8 that it was wrong, that being gay was wrong, and I didn't tell anyone until I was 18, and even then it was just my brother. So when I was a child, I knew that I was wrong. I was an imposter in my own home. And my body just inherently told me not to tell anyone because there were no examples of it in West Michigan, in my community. And the truth is, I lived convinced that my family, my friends, my job could be taken away from me if I told anyone. And the truth is that was actually a possibility, right? I mean, we all know what West Michigan is like. My family loves me, but that's still very much a process. And I worked for Spring Hill camps, and that means I certainly could have actually lost my job. So my entire life in West Michigan revolved around white heteronormative Christianity. And so that kind of meant like, if I came out, everything could be swept away. And experiencing my sexuality outside of West Michigan has certainly led to more liberation. For the first time in my life, I work for an institution that is not Christian, and I've only been there for 1 year. So that tells you how long I have sort of just remained steeped in homophobia. And being able to, I do diversity, equity, inclusion work at Northeastern University. And so in almost every training and workshop that I do, I'm able to bring in my whole self to the workshops and talk about my experience living at the margins. So that's been a really healing experience. But yeah, I mean, besides therapy and spiritual direction, those are things that have really helped me move forward, because I do believe that while it was Christianity and West Michigan culture that really led to the damage in my life. I believe it's a liberative approach to Christianity, a Christianity that is understood from the margins that will actually bring the healing that I need. So that's my sacred work, and that's your sacred work. So yeah, that's like a glimpse into West Michigan. There's a lot to say about living outside of West Michigan in terms of living in the Middle East, which was actually more liberating than living in West Michigan. Both conservative societies in different ways. But it was actually in Jordan that I had my first, what we would call queer family, friends that I could actually hang out with. And I just think it's so ironic, we've talked about this before, that in West Michigan, people have this view of like the Middle East, right? And you all know what I'm talking about, so I won't go into that.
Yeah.
But the irony is I was actually liberated in so many ways, and there's reasons for that, and it's complex. But living in the Middle East, living in London, were like huge steps towards liberation in my life.
Wow, thank you.
That was a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it was the kind of a lot that feels like a gift and leads to so many other sacred questions, I think, that maybe we'll have more time for on another day. But as you've grown in your understanding of and in your embrace of your own identity, wondering if you could speak a bit toward what even something like Pride Month, so June is Pride Month in the United States, what does Pride Month mean to you at this point in your own story?
It's a great question. And sort of what you've noted here is that, you know, every Pride evolves for me personally because I evolve. My understanding of myself and my identities, and of course, depending on which city I have been in, it's evolved. Every Pride I find myself reflecting on shame, because literally Pride exists because there is this collective shame globally around queerness. And the reality is I'm a part of a community that is oppressed. And this Pride in particular, the LGBTQIA plus community needs to really turn and face particular oppressions as they relate to our identities, and the ways in which we benefit from those systems of oppression. So I know we didn't go into this in the previous question, but my race is that I'm white, so I benefit from white supremacy, and so I'm learning what that means to embody justice for all of us, for all Black lives. And just a little quick story. Last weekend I went to a vigil and a protest for Black trans lives. And as I stood there, I was aware of how my body responds to the LGBTQI plus community because of my own homophobia and transphobia. And I'm aware of those biases that I hold in my body. But as I protest and as I stand there, I recognize how truly obscene it is that we even have to say Black trans lives matter. Because of course they matter. Of course they do. And they more than matter. They are sacred. And I can really only hold that moment, that recognition and that realization for a moment, because the reality of the world is that they don't matter. They don't matter to us. And to many of the people who are listening here, those particular lives, those particular intersections of being Black and being trans or queer, means that you just don't care. And I know that because those were the emotions and feelings I was having standing in that vigil myself. And we need to deal with those biases. We need to root that evil out. We all do. And as many people have pointed out, if anyone's on Instagram, there's just so many things. But a lot of people have pointed out that pride is truly the most authentic it's been in decades. And what that is referring to is the fight that has occurred and occurred in the original, or the origins of pride itself. I'm new to learning about queer history because West Michigan and internalized homophobia. But I'm recognizing this pride that the reasons why I even have a right to exist as a gay woman is for a reason. And what I'm deeply learning is how much my ability to exist comes from resistance and rebellions, the type of rebellions that we're seeing across the nation. And more specifically, my right to exist comes from Black trans people who put their literal bodies on the line for my future and my freedom. So this pride is truly authentic in the sense that we're all fighting, and we march and we protest because nobody is free until we're all free. So yeah, I mean, it evolves every year for me, but this year is truly reflecting on my own privileges and the ways in which, I'm a part of an oppressed community, but there are specific intersections in the LGBTQIA+ community that I need to turn and face myself.
So in your life and in your own work, just from a distance, it's been really inspiring to see your growing passion and your really unique giftedness in teaching, training, equipping on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a big part of your work right now. So in the world we're living in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of what feels like a great sort of uncovering or revealing of so much racism, systemic racism, injustice that exists in West Michigan, the United States, and our world. How are you making sense of all of that? Where are you seeing all of those things intersecting really uniquely right now?
This is a huge question. Partly because of my work, and I do recognize that it is a privilege in my work to be thinking about intersections and oppression every day, and not everyone is able to do that in a very explicit way. Everyone should be doing that regardless of their work. But yeah, I've been in a lot of conversations and a lot of programs regarding this very question. But I think it's not lost on those of us here, hopefully, that COVID-19 disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities, and that's not a separate issue from systemic racism. There's a direct correlation between Black and Brown communities contracting COVID-19 and systemic racism that's in our country. And I guess an example of this I think we're all experiencing, well, maybe experiencing lots of family group texts right now about lots of things. But last week I received in our family extended family group text an article one of my cousins sent. And this article was written by a conservative thinker explaining how systemic racism is not a partisan issue and that we need to approach it with bipartisan solutions. And he sort of summarized it by saying, the person who is wrong on something like healthcare may be right about police brutality. So in other words, you know, even though we're on the left, like we might be right about systemic racism and police brutality. And the problem with that particular statement is that healthcare itself is an example of systemic oppression, which literally leaves human bodies for dead. Those sacred bodies I mentioned earlier are literally left for dead. And I think Michigan is a prime example of this. I think, maybe it was like 2015, where a law was trying to be passed about, like, you can reserve your religious right to not treat certain people in the LGBTQI plus community. So literally just leave that person for dead. That just came to mind as an example. That if you don't have the right insurance or you don't have the right body, you're out of luck. So this specific text message, which I think we're probably all kind of experiencing these messages coming through, just demonstrates to me a lack of understanding of how and where and why racism and homophobia and transphobia are deeply ingrained in all of our systems. It's not just police brutality, and it's not just healthcare. It is education, and it is all of the things that bring us to this place where I'm coming to the Open Circle West Michigan community and talking about homophobia, because we need to talk about it, but in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to. But yeah, I think this experience, this message from my cousin just highlights that people are capable of saying racism is wrong without seeing how it actually shows up in our daily lives and in our systems and in our hospitals and in our schools. So I don't know how much that answers your question, but I think there's this like intersection that people aren't aware of, and they see police brutality, they see a white police officer kneeling on the neck of a black man and murdering him. And that's when that's clear enough, right? That we can say that's wrong. But this is happening in so many ways. It's become a real metaphor, a real powerful metaphor, that in all of our systems, we are kneeling on the necks of Black people in America. And so that systemic injustice that exists in West Michigan is real in all of those ways too. And we have to do the work to recognize how it shows up and where it shows up.
So yeah, I'm wondering, maybe you can speak a little more specifically to that, about doing that work. So I think many of us who are part of Open Circle, I think part of what even brought us to being a part of a community like Open Circle was a sense of urgency we were feeling around where everything has been headed or is headed in the world, and wanting deeply a more loving world to emerge out of what feels like so many systems, situations that at very best are off and at worst are perpetuating so much violence. What specific advice can you give us about how to do that work, so that a more loving world might be born out of this one. What are the sorts of things we should be paying attention to, learning about how we spend our time, energy, money? Would love to hear some reflection on that from you.
I love this question, because I do love the phrase, a more loving world. And I do think that work is very specific, and it has to be very, explicit, because that can be vague. It is vague. And how do we actually do that? And some of that I've mentioned a little bit about, but to be more explicit, I think some of us, not all of us, are probably reading a lot and learning a lot right now, depending on how many, kids you have and things like that. But I saw a post recently that stated the problem of individual learning. That's important. It's so important to understand intersectionality and to understand our history from a non-white washed lens, and about biases and systemic racism. Those are really important things to know about. But that individual learning is not going to change systems. We need to join organizations, we need to take collective action, and we need to organize ourselves around the things that make our systems racist. So all this reading and studying we're doing is really important. But it might just be a step, right? It might just convince us that we need to change our behavior, but it alone cannot change our behavior. I think, Matt, I'm not going to quote Richard Rohr, but there's something in the core principles of the CAC that says something like, our actions are more likely to lead us into new ways of being in the world. And that's why tools like contemplative practice and meditation become important, because that is a tool that we can use to actually behave differently in the world. And I do believe that sometimes we just need to live into what we think is right. Sometimes you have unexpected conversations with friends and you find out that they're queer, and then you're tossed into living into love. And then that transforms your understanding of both love and queer people themselves. In other words, sometimes we don't have the words, or we don't have the lived experience, or have made a decision to love someone before we just do. And that's how I feel about my experiences protesting right now. I didn't have experience protesting specifically for Black lives before these recent rebellions began. And I've never lived in a pandemic, but I've listened and I've acted, and I'm literally just like stumbling along as I learn. And I recognize that not everything I do and have said has been perfect, but that action piece is the foundation of contemplative practice, and it should be the foundation of your theology. And we need to be willing to fumble around into our theologies. We cannot let white theological patriarchal ways of thinking co-opt and determine our behavior. And the reality is that is exactly what is happening in West Michigan and so many communities, so-called Christian communities in the United States. I think sometimes before we've done enough reading on a topic to know where it's like anti-racist, many of us may have not known that phrasing before the last few weeks. But we have a sense that the right thing to do is to call your congressperson. The right thing to do is to get out and protest, to join the rebellion, to put your body on the line so that Black people who already are on the line literally every day don't have to put their own bodies on the line. And of course they are putting their bodies on the line. So yeah, I think my point there is just that it's important to read and to know things intellectually. But I think it's more rare to read something and then do something about it. I think actually when we act on something and then we come back and we're like, oh, I want to know more about racism or homophobia or whatever, that equation works more often. Acting and then learning, rather than learning and then trying to get that to motivate us to act. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, don't just sit here and listen to me, another white person, talk about oppression and power and privilege, and at some point when you're done listening to me, do nothing, right? We need to act. Yeah, and I think specifically with Open Circle, you're paying attention to voices that need to be centered. So you need to do more of that. And I deeply appreciate that. We need to recognize the essential nature of queer people in the church, precisely because I guarantee you, I know something about Christian spirituality at its core than most people who are not living life on the margins. And I know that deeply. I'm just annoyed I have to convince other people about it. And yeah, so I appreciate that you're giving your platform to other people, Matt. And I know you know this, and I love you for it. That while the world has a lot to learn from Matt Laidlaw, the world needs to learn to center other voices. And the world needs to learn to decenter whiteness and straightness and cisgenderedness to make room for what is actually essential to moving towards wholeness. If we believe what Howard Thurman says, which we should, read his books, that God is the God of the oppressed. If we truly believe that, then we need to center oppressed voices and stories. We need to center them. And words like inclusion are actually the problem. I mean, it's the reason why I have a job. So like, back to that, I guess. But the word inclusion emphasizes that there is a majority group that is making the decision to include me. And I don't need to be included. I need to be centered because I'm essential. I need to be seen as essential to the growth and the wholeness of the church and of community. In order for us to truly change our biases and in order to unlearn what we have so deeply learned, in order for me to root out my internalized homophobia, I need to hear voices at the center that reflect my experience. And I truly believe, I mean, liberation theology is cracking my world wide open right now. But just that idea that actually the only way forward, which I think folks in Open Circle understand with this idea of spiritual homelessness, that the only way forward is to center those voices. And so I do think that that's also a practical thing. So call your Congress people, text, call, email, do all of the action points, and also, continue centering voices on the margins.
Thank you. Yeah, the first part of your response there, I think is specifically helpful for me. And you mentioned Roar and others who've said we don't think our way into new ways of living, we live our way into new ways of thinking. And I know for me specifically in my temperament and personality, it's like, okay, well now I'll just go spend 10 years studying anti-racism so that I don't get it wrong when I try and help, which is radical. Yeah, potentially an Enneagram 5 here talking. But even your language of fumbling around, I think, is really, really helpful. It's a greater risk not to act these days. And if we can continue to learn from voices who have for too long been on the margins, then that fumbling around at the very least won't be misguided. So Naomi, before we go, two things. You have a little exercise for us, which maybe we can get to in a second. But before that, maybe any last words of advice? You mentioned contemplative practice and meditation. For people who are leaning in really hard right now, personally and in community with others, to do the work, any advice on remaining grounded in that, connected to source, connected to health and wholeness that you can offer us as we continue down this road?
Yeah, I do think contemplative practices can be really helpful right now. And again, to be more explicit about that, I think that's like a broad thing.
Yeah.
I think we need to breathe through our interactions. And literally, so I read an article, and maybe I can send it to you so you can send it to whoever's listening. That's really helpful regarding specifically race-based conversations, and how to take a breath when your family member says something like, if only that person didn't resist arrest, police wouldn't have retaliated. When things like that are said, it's not our job to alienate them. It's actually our job to bring them in and create a conversation. And I think taking a deep breath, practicing that meditation in real time is really important right now. And even if that means, taking a deep breath and being able to continue the conversation, or leaving the conversation, or not answering that text message for a few hours, and being able to center ourselves in a way that's actually helpful to Black and Brown people. And by that I mean, and I'm speaking to white folks right now, of course, I think that has been really helpful for me, is just being able to center myself before I react, because it is our job as white folks to call in other white folks. So I think just breathing is really important in practicing that. Second, I think, and what should be clear from most of what I've said today, is that spiritual practice right now is literally protesting. It is action. There's no difference between spirituality and action right now, and ever, but I think we're seeing right now, it's really prominent. It's really obvious, right, what we're seeing. So until we show up for one another, we're doing spiritual practice wrong. You just got to show up, and you'll learn something by showing up. Like I mentioned, just standing in solidarity with Black trans people was a sacred, deeply spiritual moment for me. And it revealed something to me about myself and about my relationship to the world. And last, I would say, what you just emphasized, that reading a book or listening to a podcast won't change my behavior, even though Brene Brown's Unlocking Us podcast should be listened to by all of us. Yeah, I need to let things sink deeply in my body, and I think that's where meditation really comes in for me, and intention setting, where I have all these things coming at me, information, ideas, awareness even of biases that I hold in my body. And the only way that I am going to undo those biases is to immerse myself in that unlearning process. It's to sit and meditate on and breathe through a new way of being in the world. And so I think that's specifically where meditation comes in for me, is taking that information and actually letting it go deeply into my bones, and my blood, and my body. Because we've been bombarded with racism, white supremacy, our whole lives. And so trying to change that isn't it's not shallow work, it's deep, deep work. So to that end, I think I would really hate if we left today without actually doing that, without setting an intention. And so for those of you listening, we're going to take 2 minutes to set an intention for the week, to set an action for the week. So Matt and I are, in a moment, we're going to turn off our videos for the next 2 minutes and allow us all to use our utensil and paper and write it out, or if you're with your kid and you got to talk to your kid about it, whatever way works for you, to take that 2 minutes and just set an intention for the week. An example of that, just in case folks haven't written intentions before, is, I'm a white person that likes to talk a lot. I'm a verbal processor. So in my meetings this week, I'm going to surf the silence and make space for other folks to speak in a meeting. So that's an example of an intention. Another intention could just simply be, I'm going to respond to the family text regarding that anti-Black racist remark and practice anti-racism. That's an intention. So these are examples of ways that we can actually take action and set an intention. So before we turn off our videos, let's take 3 deep breaths together. And then Matt and I will turn off our videos and we'll have 2 minutes. So let's just take 3 deep breaths. So we'll take 2 minutes and we'll see you back at that time. Thank you for participating in that practice. I truly hope we can all find in ourselves an ability to take some form of action this week, whether that be unlearning something, learning something new, calling our congresspeople, hope we're able to do that this week.
Naomi, thank you. Thank you for the gift of your presence, your vulnerability, your story, your willingness to speak so precisely to our community and to what is happening in the world right now. Couldn't be more grateful and couldn't be more excited about all that you're up to in your work these days. So we will continue to follow you. And I hope this is the first of many future conversations together. So thank you.
Me too. It is a healing experience to do things like this for me as well. So I appreciate the invitation.
My Open Circle family, this week, may we have eyes to see. Peace be with you, my friends. Have a great week.